request Aruchal Viveramani to introduce American Humanist Association, Fred Edwards.
Fred Edwards was Executive Director of the American Humanist Association for the last 15 years, editor of the Humanist magazine for 12, National Director of the United Coalition for Reason for 6, and sat for 8 years on the broader Social Impacts Committee of the Hall of Human Origin at the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. He is the past president of Camp Quest, has served on the board of the International Humanist and Ethical Union, now known as the Humanist International, and has over the past 40 years appeared on local and national radio and television in the United States and Canada. He has been interviewed on the radio and for newspapers around the world and has lectured in North America, Europe, and in India. Now retired, he volunteers as the American Humanist Association's historian and is the Humanist Celebrant Emeritus of the Humanist Society. As part of this grand finale evening of this historical two-day conference on humanism and self-respect, with pride in our hearts as humanists, on behalf of Periyar International, we would like to invite Fred Edwards to share his thoughts on how to live a happier life with a free mind. Mr. Fred Edwards.
Respect, but you'll notice right under it, it says, live a happier life with a free mind. So when I saw that was going to be part of the theme of this conference, I thought, well, I bet you they're going to have a lot of talks on happiness. Well, I looked at the speaker lineup and found that nobody was talking about happiness. And so I said, I'll talk about happiness, because you see, there's one important thing about the issue of happiness that a lot of people trivialize it. They think it isn't important. But you see, throughout this conference, we've been talking about how, whether it's poetry in the Vedas or whether it is the work of Periyar or what it is, that the whole aim of our efforts has been to bring the issues we deal with down to the ordinary person, that we are here to help the average person, not just the wealthy, not just those who are religious leaders, but ordinary people, that we want to lift up ordinary people. We want to lift them up with their rights, their civil liberties. We want to improve their lives economically. We want fair play. But when you start getting down to why we do that, it's because we want people to be happy. We want to spread happiness around. Humanism is a philosophy that says that rationality leads to happiness, and that human rights lead to happiness, and that better economic conditions lead to happiness. And so therefore, it becomes part of our humanist mission to increase happiness worldwide. And now we are being joined in that by the United Nations. The United Nations General Assembly in 2012 named March 20th, the beginning of spring, as the International Day of Happiness. And I'm going to quote the UN on this. This was to recognize the relevance of happiness and well-being as universal goals and aspirations in the lives of human beings around the world. And on that spring date each year, the UN releases a World Happiness Report, which rates 156 countries by how happy their citizens perceive themselves to be according to their evaluations of their own lives. In these reports, all of the Scandinavian countries keep showing up in the top 10. Well, the United States continues to rank lower. This year it fell to 19th place. But the 5 largest drops in happiness over the past few years have occurred in Yemen, India, Syria, Botswana, and Venezuela. Now, you've seen these countries in the news. Yemen with its brutal civil war, famine, and epidemics, India with its population stresses, systemic corruption, and sanitation challenges, Syria with multiple warring parties, crimes against humanity, and desertification, Botswana with widespread poverty, the HIV/AIDS crisis, and its own climate crisis, and Venezuela with economic collapse, high crime, political corruption, and shortages of basic necessities. These countries reveal many of the barriers to happiness. But are there solutions? Yes. These are addressed in the Global Happiness and Well-Being Policy Report, issued by some of the world's leading academics and professionals specializing in the subject. The United Arab Emirates launched this effort only last year, doing so, quote, to identify best happiness practices of government, business, schools, city planning, health systems, and other institutions in society, end quote. And then to outline how those best practices can be put into operation. This makes the 2019 report a sort of up-to-date handbook for increasing happiness around the world. With efforts like these underway today, we can see that serious university professors, scientists, researchers, and policymakers are now studying happiness. There is also a college-level Science of Happiness course offered by the University of California at Berkeley. Since its launch in 2014, roughly 500,000 students have registered for the 8-week program, taking it either on campus or through the internet. Finding happiness, therefore, has become a big deal in our troubled times. So what is happiness exactly? One expert, Sonia Lyubomirsky, who is a professor of positive psychology at the University of California at Riverside, defines it as the experience of joy, contentment, or positive well-being combined with a sense that one's life is good, meaningful, and worthwhile. A lot of words, but not very helpful unless unpacked. So let's begin our clarification by noting that some of the things that happiness is not. Now, we understand that serious national problems like hunger, violence, and addiction stand in the way of happiness. But it should be understood that the removal of these things can only provide a prerequisite for happiness, a foundation, not its realization. The same is true on a personal level. Human beings have basic survival needs for air, water, food, and so forth. These are the necessary but not sufficient conditions for happiness. Similarly, pain can prove overwhelming and thereby an almost impossible distraction from the pursuit of happiness. And not just physical pain, but psychological suffering, such as fear of becoming a victim of violence or the imaginary fears generated by superstition and religious paranoia. But a life free of pain and fear isn't automatically a happy one. This is why there can actually be disease patients who are happy, while others in great health can be miserable. There are happy homeless people and miserable millionaires, happy hermits and unhappy socialites, happy believers and unhappy unbelievers. This is because happiness, instead of being a list of checked off need boxes, is an overall positive evaluation of one's life and an overall positive state of mind. And getting there is a separate task after sufficient relief of suffering has been accomplished. I should add some other things that happiness isn't. Happiness isn't to be confused with morality. Although we hear frequent claims that moral life choices make people happy, we know that virtue isn't always rewarded. We've been told how many times Perrier wound up in jail. We know that virtue isn't always rewarded. Indeed, when brave people advancing noble causes take the moral high road against enemies who are too powerful, these brave people can be made to suffer, whether through physical or emotional pain. Happiness isn't to be confused with personal achievement or money. As Perrier put it, there is no use in simply acquiring titles or amassing wealth if one has no self-respect. But what about pleasure? Hedonism is a philosophy that tries to define happiness as pleasure. It has been popular in both the East and West, and from ancient times to the present. But hedonism runs into trouble once it's recognized that some pleasures require painful activities to reach them, such as traveling a difficult road to reach rejuvenating hot springs. And others have painful side effects, such as enjoying too large a banquet and then getting sick afterwards. Also, some pleasures last longer than others, but the longer-lasting ones tend to be less intense. Compare, for example, a leisurely day at the beach to the brief and sporadic thrills of speeding down a water slide. And then you got to walk all the way up that ladder again. All of these issues have to be taken into account if one's goal is to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And such accounting requires a lot of evaluations and mental calculations to determine the relative intensity and difficulty of each available pleasure so you can snatch the most delight at the least cost in life's bargain basement of happiness. To many, that's a lot of unpleasurable work. Beyond this, there's the problem of compounding too many pleasures at once. The pursuit of one pleasure can actually get in the way of another, such as when you go to a restaurant famous for its desserts, but then eat so much of its enjoyable main meal that you become too full to still desire the special dessert you originally came for. And too long a string of high-intensity pleasures can become exhausting, such as dancing and partying all night. Therefore, pleasurable experiences often have to be broken up and spread out over time, interspersed with more ordinary experiences in order to be fully appreciated. If you do that, however, you actually end up reducing the frequency of your pleasures. And this means that the sum total of accumulated pleasures can never add up to more than a fraction of anyone's life. So there's just too much of that empty time with boredom and pain. So what is happiness then? In summarizing part of what science has learned about the subject, the Mayo Clinic reports the following. Only a small percentage of the variation in people's reports of happiness can be explained by differences in their circumstances. It appears that the bulk of what determines happiness is due to personality, and more important, thoughts and behaviors that can be changed. This confirms the wisdom of the ancient Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who, in addressing the problem of unhappiness in Roman times, famously said, "People are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them," which means that happiness is a state of mind, a positive evaluation of one's overall situation. Now, one aspect of that positive evaluation is the idea that one's life is meaningful. Now, when I say this, I'm not referring to some belief that one is cosmically important or has a significant place in the universe, nor am I talking about being loved or having a sense of belonging. I'm talking about having a sense of purpose. The Mayo Clinic reports that people who strive to meet a goal or fulfill a mission tend to be happiest. Albert Einstein, with a bit of hyperbole, went further. He said, "All we need to make us happy is something to be enthusiastic about." As Humanist Manifesto 3 declares, "We aim for our fullest possible development and animate our lives with a deep sense of purpose, finding wonder and awe in the joys and beauties of human existence." But our aspirations don't have to be grand, like finding a cure for cancer or writing the great American novel. They can be of more commonplace importance, like rearing children. They can even be purely recreational, like planning a vacation or restoring an old car. A central feature of goal-oriented pursuits is struggle, the overcoming of obstacles, and even failing. Think again about Perrier. A life of struggle was fulfilling for him. This process of struggle is frequently painful or frustrating, but these aspects don't take away from the role that a vital and absorbing purpose can have in our overall happiness. Here's why. For almost all of human history, throughout the world, human life has been, in the words of philosopher Thomas Hobbes, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Yet people have continued to work hard, persevere, and build families. At the beginning of World War II, Winston Churchill energized his nation with the purely pessimistic promise, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." Why did this work? When the going gets tough, why don't people just give up? No doubt some have. But those usually haven't been the ones to pass their genes on to the next generation. As a result, we today are the descendants of the survivors and thrivers, the ones who not only endured the struggle for existence, but felt driven to stay in the game. And what's true for humans is true for every surviving animal species. All have had to run the gauntlet of the Darwinian jungle. So today, when life is comfortable for those of us lucky enough to live in the global north, the drive to engage in struggle still persists and needs to find new outlets. Think about a typical house cat. Why would it play with a mouse and run the risk of losing it? Why wouldn't it just eat it? And the answer is because it isn't hungry, but it still wants to hunt. Likewise with humans, we who live comfortably in rich nations don't have to forage for food, fend off predatory animals, and otherwise fight to stay alive, but we still feel invigorated by the prospect of struggle and can't go long without new pursuits, contests, adventures, conflicts, and dramas. Therefore, when the real problems and obstacles that plagued our ancestors or that plague poor nations today disappear, we make up imaginary ones. We play sports, we create art, we join political causes, we dream the impossible dream. We even get into fights with our neighbors. Such things excite us and provide not only a reason to get up in the morning, but a reason to live. The conflicts involved don't have to be negative, however. They can instead be engaging, involving us in something we deeply enjoy. Some of us find that the work we do for a living falls into that category. It is gratifying and thus more rewarding and lasting than short-term satisfactions. The hours seem to fly by because we are so immersed and in the zone. This afterwards leads to a positive mood as we reflect on a day well spent. Finally, when we regard life as worthwhile, we are concluding that we are engaged in something of value, experiencing a suitable portion of enjoyment in that enterprise, or at the very least, finding some point in soldiering on. Thus, our sense of purpose is expressed in actions that engage us in short and long-term pursuits and strike us as bringing value day by day and year by year. These are its basic ingredients. But they are only among the necessary ingredients. They still aren't sufficient by themselves. Thus, you can be driven by a passion that provides meaning and energizes each day, but you can experience that drive in a context of a general dissatisfaction with life. One example would be working hard to bring aids to victims of a disaster, while all the while railing at the world for making the disaster happen in the first place, or feeling disgust for the politicians and others who aren't helping you enough. Hence, motivation and striving don't by themselves equal happiness. So we aren't there yet, but we're close. Which brings us to the title of this talk, Live a Happier Life with a Free Mind. What do I mean by a free mind? I mean an independent mind that is capable of rationally analyzing life's situations and then managing one's emotions in ways that foster a positive response. Epictetus, the Roman Stoic philosopher who I already mentioned, put it well when he spoke about going to the public bath. In ancient Roman times, they didn't go to a swimming pool, they went to a public bath. But it was the same sort of idea. And he said, when you're about to engage in an activity, remind yourself what that activity entails. If you're going to the public bath, think about what often happens at baths: the splashing, pushing, cursing, stealing. For you will encounter it more calmly if you start by saying to yourself, I intend to bathe, but also to keep my mind at ease. This sort of emotional self-management not only prepares you for the worst, but also has an upside. Since the bad things that you brace yourself for don't usually happen, you can often feel a sense of elation when things go smoothly. The underlying principle is this: happiness and unhappiness, which occur within your own mind, are the result of regulating your demands on life in contrast to the reality about you. This makes happiness relative to the relationship between your demands and what life actually delivers. So if the world provides outcomes that prove more positive than the emotional requirements or expectations that you have placed on it, you'll feel happy. On the other hand, if reality turns out more negatively than what you'd required or emotionally insisted on, you will feel unhappy. This is the relativity of happiness principle, and it means that happiness can be managed by the manipulation of your level of tolerance for or acceptance of what happens or what is. One way to manipulate your tolerance is to consciously lower your requirements for what you would consider emotionally acceptable, as Epictetus did before going to the public bath. That's the age-old secret of happiness in a nutshell. You have two polarities to work with: reality and the standards you set for it. Work the polarities one way, and happiness results. Work them the other, and you suffer misery. Now, I know someone who strongly desires that people always obey the rules of the road. Indeed, she wants this so badly that she readily notices imperfect driving and complains about it. She has turned her reasonable preference for better driving by others into an urgent need for it, which leads her to engage in a sort of mental policing of what others do. And this renders her driving experiences unhappy ones. Because she requires that the realities of the road be better than they actually are, she suffers as a result. This doesn't have to be you. All you have to remember is that you aren't in direct control of what life delivers, but you can take control of the requirements you place on life. You can take control of what you will regard as necessary for your happiness. Specifically, if you harbor unrealistically high requirements or expectations, disappointment will be a frequent and possibly devastating companion. But if you have realistic requirements or expectations, or even ones a little on the low side, your prospects for happiness go up. The same applies to events of the past. If you require yourself to have had a happy childhood in order to be happy now, and you conclude that you didn't have a happy childhood, you will feel miserable. But if you have no such requirement, or if you allow yourself to remember and focus on the happier times, you will feel better. All other things being equal, this process of effectively managing the requirements you place on life will lead you to more contentment, a positive sense of well-being. When you punctuate this with occasional moments of joy or delight, the overall result is what we call happiness. The main point here is that a free mind is one that is willing and able to take responsibility for happiness and take control of it. A free human being is one who acts to do so. Success at such action is what we call self-mastery. And with self-mastery comes self-respect.